will try to do justice to all of the things that you have said. A tall order, I think, especially when I think about all of the personal feelings and relationships that so many of you have to this industry. I want to just clarify a few things, and the most important one is that my book does not deal at all with the tobacco workers, the people who are involved in the industrial side of the process. And that was a decision that I made very early on, because incredible work has been done on the activism of the tobacco workers and the literacy and the high level of political involvement and all of those things. And the processes are so separated. The agricultural process in so many ways doesn't have much to do with the industrial side of the process, at least in Puerto Rico. In other places it's not the case. But in Puerto Rico they were so separated, they were owned differently, they were managed differently. So I wanted to really concentrate on purpose on the piece that we knew the least about, which was, or I should say the piece that we knew nothing about, which was really the growing of the leaf, which remained in the hands of Puerto Ricans, unlike other crops, for the majority of its history, even with heavy investment by American Tobacco and a lot of the other companies, Puerto Rican Tobacco Company. There was the growing of it, the majority, most, I would say, of the growing remained in Puerto Rican hands. And to me that was fascinating because it's so different from the historiographical tradition of agriculture left the hands of Puerto Ricans and became part of the American damaging of the island, if you will. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about sort of the historiographical growth, I think, that had to happen for me to get to the point where I could put these arguments forward. And some of the questions that guided the work as I was researching, and all of the questions really came out of the research. It was actually quite interesting. I went into it thinking that I was going to do this very straightforward economic study of tobacco and the cultivating of tobacco leaf, and that I would go through the cycles in great detail, and it was all fascinating to me. And then I stumbled upon all of these things, which I'll tell you about. So I want to talk about that and why tobacco, and then just give you a really brief overview of the book, and then I'll deal with your questions, the ones that I remember. I'll deal with them right away, and if I haven't answered them, please ask them again, because I would love to deal with them directly. So this is really a history of activism, a history of participation, a history of negotiation. And when I always say that it wasn't until I left Puerto Rico and got to the United States to go to college and then to study in graduate school that I really began to study the history of the island, right? I mean, I went through high school on the island, and you get it's the same curriculum as here, right? History of the US 1, History of the US 2, World History 1, World History 2, and then senior year, right? When you're ready, finally, to understand what has happened, then you get History of Puerto Rico, right? For 2 semesters, and I had the fortune of having a very radical history teacher that didn't last. He was fired after he taught us. That he's very proud that this is what I do for a living. Really a very, very interesting young professor that really changed, I think, a lot of what I thought and a lot of the way that I read. And so anyway, so I started reading. I said, well, I don't know anything about what people have been writing. What is this thing, historiography? I didn't even know what that was, right? So I started reading the old histories, right, written in the 1930s and even earlier, but really in the 1930s, with the interest in trying to figure out what had been the effect of the American occupation of Puerto Rico in 1898, 30 years later, right, on the eve of the Depression. And what were the effects of that, socially, culturally, economically, and basically all the books are saying they came in, they screwed it all up, and now we're worse than we were before, right? So we have to question what that means. So I started reading all of these histories, and in these histories there was all of this language of docility, right? The docile Puerto Rican. That comes, by the way, from the 19th century, right? But it became a trope. It became how Puerto Ricans were defined in the scholarly literature of the time, in the scholarly history, right? So this docile Puerto Rican, and I was so upset about this. I couldn't believe that this was something. Was it really true? I mean, this is where I came from. These histories of docility and a colonial whatever you want to call it, right? Sort of like laying down and taking it, however you want to say it, right? And so I read the Nueva Historia, right, which I thought must be different, right? I mean, the 1970s, the history where we're giving voice to people that supposedly didn't have any, right? And this trope wasn't really much different, right? It was, they had voice, but there was no change, right? There was struggle, but there was no effect. And I was like, oh man, so here we are again. And just this sense of, it doesn't matter what you do, you can't win. And that was really upsetting to me. It made me question the way that we had been thinking about history. And so I said, okay, well, I'm an economic historian, I'm not a political scientist, I'm not, a sociologist, I have a background in psychology of all things. So maybe that's why it was so upsetting, right? So I decided that I'm going to do this very sort of straightforward, economic history of something that we didn't know anything about, because we knew a lot about the workers, but we didn't know about anything about how the leaf was produced. We just knew that the Americans had taken it over. That's really all we knew. And all of the histories of the island would say, sugar, 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 tobacco the second most important product, sugar, 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 etc. Right? So there was, other than tobacco being the second most important product, nobody had ever studied it. So I said, okay, great, I got it, I found it, it's great. I can do what I like, which is crunch numbers and then figure it out. And then I get to Puerto Rico and I start crunching the numbers and I realize that it's all small farms. That the tobacco companies own very little land, most of which is dedicated to research. That and that doesn't change a lot. It changes, but it doesn't change a lot. That the patterns of land concentration that we see in the sugar areas, where people are consolidating larger and larger and larger tracts of land, do not happen in tobacco country. That in fact it's the opposite. That land is becoming fragmented, and that people are staying in tobacco regions because there are opportunities that may be better than the ones available in the dominant economic areas of the island. And I sort of start to think, boy, this is really different, and what am I going to do? How am I going to explain this? And so then I had this idea of going into the Centro de Investigaciones Históricas in La Yupi and look at the minutes. In some document, some notary record in Caguas, I find a note that this person had gone to the Asociación de Agricultores meeting in Caguas and presented lobbied for the formation of a tobacco island-wide cooperative. And I was like, really? They had those? So then I started studying all of that history of the Asociación de Agricultores, of the Asociación Insular de Tabacaleros de Puerto Rico, which was not for the workers at all. It was all farmers, right? And they were in solidarity. In other words, they knew of each other and clearly they were interdependent. But it doesn't seem, at least from the membership rolls, that there was a lot of interconnectedness in terms of membership and things like that. So what I find is this history, and people writing letters to the president and saying, in our visit to, President so-and-so, we had a 3-hour meeting where we told the president, and I was stunned by this, and that we didn't know any of this, that nobody knew this, right? That we had access to the sitting president of the United States, that we had access to the senators, that we had access to limited access, agreed, right? We cannot delete that. It's a limited, we don't have a representative in Congress that is elected, that has a vote, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, we all know that, right? But that they could walk in. I found a letter from the Secretary of the Department of Agriculture who said, whenever a group of Puerto Ricans want to come in, just please, my door is always open. So all of a sudden I started to think, I'm not buying this whole idea of docility, or I think we need to think about what that means and how that has been defined, and can we accept this narrative of what Puerto Ricans are like or were like in the face of American domination, right? And And so then that led me to study empire, right? And you know, U.S. empire studies is relatively new, right? I mean, most of the empire literature in the United States was exceptional, right? No, the United States is not an empire at all. And then it changed into, well, yes, but we are an exceptional empire because we're not like all the other empires, right? We are democratic and participatory and lovely, right? So the literature really center around that. And then now, historians and political scientists are really doing what British scholars have been doing for 50 years, which is really looking at how the empire manifests itself, that empires are living entities, and that they have to, in some way, formally, informally, authoritatively, democratically, in all of those ways, manifest themselves in a local population, and that those manifestations can take many different ways, that those can be manifested in many different ways, let's just say, right? So that was the main, when I had all the research, then that was the question, those were the questions that began to guide how I would think about the material, right? How does the empire manifest in Puerto Rico? How does U.S. colonialism work on the island? Do we even know what U.S. colonialism looked like on the island? Other than, this is a tutelary project, right? We're gonna teach Puerto Ricans how to be democratic, and then eventually set them on a path, all of that, right? But then how does that work? When they get to the island, what happens, right? And most important for me was, how did Puerto Ricans negotiate that empire, right? How does that happen? What do they do? Do they really are just like, we're so grateful that you're here, right? Or were they just so stunned that they couldn't do anything? Or were they just so docile that they just didn't care, right? And I didn't buy any of those. So then it became about, how do we think about participation? Was there room for participation? And all of the research that other scholars who are much more interesting talk about is that empires and colonialism are ever changing, and that they have to react on both sides. The empire has to react to the subjects, and the subjects have to react to the empire. And that when those two things, that empire does not work if those two things don't come together at some point, right? And that revolution happens when that stops working, right? If there is no communication, then there is revolution, right? So that was really interesting to me, right? Is it docility that we are talking about? Is it inaction? Or is it, am I making enough changes that I don't feel the need to break, right? And this is like the ultimate question, right? For anybody who's interested in Puerto Rico, right? What do we do now? How do we go from here? How do we use this history to move forward, if we can, etc. So those are some of the questions that were interesting to me. And then, why tobacco? First, it was just an alternative to sugar, and I did not want to write something else about sugar. I mean, I think Cesar Ayala and then Cesar and Rafael's book. That's it. I mean, there is very little that I think needs to be written about sugar at this point. And tobacco was, for many years, the most important employer of Puerto Ricans on the island, more than sugar even. And it was particularly important because it employed people in the center of the island, in the mountain regions of the island. So they were, tobacco was an incredible producer of revenue for the state. It was an important employer of Puerto Ricans, and it was owned by Puerto Ricans. So those three things for me were sort of like a perfect storm of a discrete industry that I could examine, and that people sort of felt a sense of ownership, right? That people are proud of Puerto Rican tobacco, and they wanted to know more about that. So the book is really divided into two parts, and those of you who have read it, you probably know this already, and that's why when you said you read chapter 3, I was like, yes, that's a good chapter. Because the first two chapters are what I originally intended, which was just a socioeconomic study of the industry, right? How was it grown? How did it expand, and why, where? how many farms, how did it change, what were the cycles of contraction and expansion for tobacco leaf, and how it changed after the Depression with the advent of cigarettes, and how the industry had to adapt to that, and farmers had to adapt to that, how it grew, and you can see this is perfect example of tobacco country. That's a ranch in the back. The terrain was beautiful in terms of soil, but really difficult to cultivate because it's all steep hills, right? So not much grows except for this beautiful leaf. You can see again, I mean, some of these are almost vertical. There's another one I think coming up where you'll see two people working and they're almost standing straight and the mountain is like in front of their face. These are, of course, despalilladoras and people working in the curing of tobacco, which was actually not part of the industrial side of it. It was actually handled by farmers. They actually handled the curing and the storing, and then only when it was cured and ready would it be sold to the Americans. So you can see some people in the back as we talk. So the first two so the first chapter does all of that. The second chapter really talks about what life was like there, how many families lived there, how were they, because one of the great narratives, I think, of this time period in Puerto Rico until 1940 is that families were destroyed, right? That families were separated because men had to leave looking for work, and we know that happened, that was true, but it was certainly not the only thing that happened. And in tobacco country in particular, families remained intact. Families migrated together into tobacco country and they stayed together in tobacco country because there was opportunity there. There was land, there was opportunity, people could purchase land. And you could grow tobacco profitably in very little land, which is also different from sugar, right? So that's the second chapter, deals with the demographic sort of overview of that region. And then the last three chapters are the real interesting ones, I think, where I use all of this industrial expansion and agricultural expansion to talk about how people organized, how people adapted, how people lobbied for things that would reinforce, shore up, and make more profitable this industry that they were participating in. And they did that by lobbying in Washington, by lobbying in San Juan, by calling to task both the local senators and the senators in Washington to support tobacco, just like they were doing here in the United States. And during the years of the Depression, by demanding that federal legislation be extended to Puerto Rico that would protect the tobacco sector in particular. And they were unbelievably successful at doing that. So to answer, I think, your question of what came first, right? I think that nothing came first. I think that this all happened at once, right? And so I think that farmers had begun to organize the larger farmers, as usual, which is what normally happens. The larger farmers, the literate farmers, become aware that they are now able to organize because it's allowed under the law, under the colonial law, right? Ironically. And so they begin to organize and ligas agrícolas, these small agricultural leagues, very localized, become the first step for farmers to come together. And the idea was that Puerto Rican farmers knew everything that was going on with federal law. They knew everything. They knew it because it was in the newspaper. They knew it because people talked about it. They knew it when there was radio eventually, then they knew it through the radio. But they were unbelievably well connected and they understood what was happening. So they knew that law had been passed that allowed groups of farmers to borrow money together at better rates than they could get from private lenders, because banking at this point is still very rudimentary in Puerto Rico. And so they decide that what they're going to do, and this is with the support of the Department of Agriculture, that they are going to begin to organize so that when the law is eventually extended to Puerto Rico, which they're confident it's going to happen, they will be ready to take advantage of this, right? They'll be like, oh, we're already organized, here we go, here's our application, where do we sign, right? So these things are happening together, right? There is an interest in organizing just because it's more power in terms of borrowing money. There is more power in terms of securing a better price from the purchaser, and because it have offered a little bit of protection, right, in terms of abuses from lenders and from the American tobacco companies, right, which were sometimes the direct buyers of the leaf. Most of it was bought actually by middlemen, who were the actual lenders. So you would go to a lender, usually a merchant in town, and you would borrow money to grow your crop. And then at that point, you agree on a price for your crop, regardless of what happens, right? If the crop in Connecticut, for example, is ruined because of terrible weather, and your crop is now worth 3 times the price that you had agreed to, you still get that price that you agreed to. So again, this was a lot of very weekly reports about what the price was in other places, what the conditions of cultivation were in Cuba, in the Dominican Republic, in Indonesia, in Connecticut, in India. It's insane, right? I mean, they're so well informed, right? And this information is being passed from farmer to farmer to farmer because most of the tobacco farmers can't read or write, right? So federal, or local, I should say insular, agricultural agents and other large farmers who are volunteering go from farm to farm to farm saying, this is what's happening, this is how we're doing, this is the benefit. If you affiliate, we can guarantee that you will at least get this much money per pound, right? So they're very successful at getting farmers to understand what organization is all about, to become affiliated, not all of them, but enough of them that it makes a difference. So just to answer that a little bit, I think that it's all happening at once. And then when the law is passed that cooperatives can borrow money, then Puerto Ricans change those ligas into cooperatives, right? So the charter is a cooperative and people invest and then they can apply for money. And then when that law changes again, then they change again from individual tobacco cooperatives and banks, they were called banks. They affiliate into one tobacco insular-wide cooperative, island-wide cooperative, so that they have even more power. They affiliate then with the Asociación de Agricultores, which is the one organization that becomes really politically able to cash in on all of this agitation. And that has a sort of a direct line into Washington. I mean, they're always in Washington. Many of the resident commissioners were former tobacco growers that had been involved with the Asociación, that had become president of the Asociación, that had then become resident commissioners, right? And I have some quotes in the book and a slide. Oh no, not in this one, but I can share with you a slide of what one of them said. But it's these things they become a really interesting political force, not a political class per se. It's interesting, I think, and you can say more about this, but they don't become a political class, and part of it is they make a commitment that they are not going to become a party. It's in their mandate. They decide as an organization that they will not, but that they will support people who are friendly to farmers, of course, right? So that's how they use their muscle. But in terms of, they do not want to have a party. They will not come out in support or against anybody in particular all the time. It will only be issue specific. So it's really quite interesting. They become really incredible advocates for what is good for agriculture. And they're together, right? The Asociación includes sugar growers, coffee growers, tobacco growers, frutos menores, right? Tubers and oranges and pineapples, tomatoes, right? Anybody who is growing, it becomes a part of this. But the tobacco growers are among the original founders, and a few of them become the president of the organization at different times. So that's the third chapter. And what I tried to do with those last 3 chapters is talk about how do Puerto Ricans negotiate imperial control? How do they deal with U.S. colonialism? And what are 3 areas of imperial control that you're not supposed to be able to negotiate, right? What are the things that the empire controls and we're not, that's it, we can't touch, right? And I, of course, leave off military because I don't want to, that's not my work. Other people do that and do it well. So I thought about politics as the political structure, access to the structure, right? Because you can be kept away from that really effectively, right? Legislation, right? How do you change legislation? Because that is what ultimately rules you, right? And then finally, a transfer of technology, right? We know that there is always a constant transfer of technology between the empire and the colony, but that it's always top down, and that it's always from the empire to the colony. And I was interested in seeing how Puerto Ricans negotiated that, and if that was really the case. So the third chapter deals with politics. The fourth chapter deals with the legislative piece of it and how Puerto Ricans pushed to have important legislation passed on the island that they could then take advantage. Everything from credit legislation to scientific funding. Funding for scientific research, I should say, which is what the third chapter deals with, is the technology transfer. Who was in charge of it? How did they do it? How did being affiliated help with the technology transfer? Did it give them more access, less access? Those issues. And so what I hope to do with this work, or what I hope that this work has done, is really demonstrate that colonialism in Puerto Rico was always negotiated. From 1899, it was negotiated. And especially after 1917, when Puerto Ricans began to use this idea of being a ciudadano americano to demand what they thought was their own right to intervene in the affairs, and this is their language, intervene in the affairs that rule their daily life. And they used that language, and they went to Congress, and they lobbied in Congress saying, you're going to do this for Mississippi? Great. Then you should do it for the for the citizens of Puerto Rico. You're going to add, you're going to extend agricultural adjustment payments for tobacco growers in Alabama and Georgia. Then you are certainly going to do it for the tobacco growers in Caguas and in Comerío. And they do. They win, right? Which is the end result is that there is change, that there is effect. Right, which was a piece that I think is sometimes missing from our historiography, that there's all this agitation, but we don't see the end result. What is the end result? How have we changed? Were we successful? Within the limits of colonialism, right? I mean, we can't delete that. It doesn't get deleted, but it doesn't mean that Puerto Ricans have been docile, or that they have stood back, or that they haven't gotten everything that they have now, including the mess, because they have fought for that. Because even this mess is Puerto Rican done. Right? I may not be popular for saying that, but and I think that we were talking about this last night, and I will be bold and share it here. But I think that the history of victimization of Puerto Ricans on the face of the American Empire has to include the moments when the Puerto Rican population has been victimized, without a doubt. Right? We can't forget that. But it also cannot be the only story that we tell. Because what it does is it makes people, it gets people off the hook. It gets us off the hook, right? If we are just victims, if we don't have any power at all, then it's not our fault. And if it's not my fault, then I don't have to do anything to fix it, which is exasperating, right? Because I think we are in the position that we are in today because it's not my fault, right? And I can't change it. It's this evil empire, right? It's not, right? We made those decisions. We took out those loans. Were American lenders completely irresponsible? Yes, right? But we signed those loans, right? And we kept borrowing when we knew we couldn't pay it. We keep hiring people in the government when we can't pay the payroll, etc., right? The Americans aren't saying, you have to hire more people for your Department of Transportation because, gee, you don't have enough secretaries, or whatever, right? You don't have enough administrators. They're not saying that. Those are all local decisions that are made at the local level. So if we don't ever talk about a history of activism and participation and challenge and negotiation and change, then we are never going to change what needs to be changed now. We forget that is where we come from. So anyway, so that is what I hope to start to do with work like this, and in the conversations that I have had. I always say that I hope that this shows a position of power even within a colonial structure where power is in Washington. Ultimate power is in Washington, but that Puerto Ricans had quite a bit, much more than agency, I think, but really quite a bit of say in what happens in the local level. So I don't know if I answered your question, Agustin, but I'm happy to answer anything else or anything specific from your readings. You said that you had some questions about the work that you read.
Yeah. Well, before, how much time do we,
It's 1:15, so you tell me.
What's the usual protocol for?
Well, I would think that we should probably maybe at 1:15.
Yeah.
2 o'clock? Until 2 o'clock?
Yeah. So that would be what?
Half an hour.
Half an hour. Half an hour for questions.
That's great. Yes.
Well, thank you for the presentation, for making the book available for us. Puerto Rico is a colony, in more colonies. There is a major problem in nurturing and fostering and preserving historical memory as part of the imperial project. Any historical account recovering the past for me is more than a welcome addition. It is something that allows us to have probably a self-esteem that our own educational system attempts consistently to crush. And of course, we have resistance in different ways of resisting that. I have several questions, and I would like to say something at the end, something about victimization. The first question is that it is something similar to what Carmen has said. You said that they are all related, the way that the cooperative came into existence. But the argument that you present here in the book is that there was apparently one stage between 119 and 120 when there were many cooperatives. Mm-hmm. And then you said that when a federal law was extended to Puerto Rico, apparently making it explicit that through the creation of cooperatives,
yes,
independent farmers were going to get loans.
Mm-hmm.
Then at that moment there was a kind of explosion
Absolutely.
in the creation of cooperatives. So on the basis of this sequence that you present, my conclusion is yes, there were the ligas agrícolas and there were some cooperatives that were established out of a kind of independent action by civil society, that would be my term. But at the same time, that is another point when basically the activity in Puerto Rico, insofar as the creation of cooperatives is concerned, or was concerned, was in a way driven or motivated by this extension to Puerto Rico of the federal law. So, for me, that's a way of resisting, and that's a way of taking advantage of all financial opportunities. Then the second question, and let me say that this was a kind of hidden secret that apparently the book has, because the book is in a way emphasizing the marketing, that is to say, independent organizations that apparently have nothing to do with the existing political structure at the moment, with Partido Liberal, Partido Socialista, there were apparently organizations set up by the growers and probably the workers. You mentioned about the No Siembra campaign. Mm-hmm. You discussed the lobbying efforts in Washington. You mentioned the influential role of el agricultor puertorriqueño, the magazine, and how people were writing articles. And you stress how there was a big difference between, in a way, the exploitation by the native, allow me the term, that is to say by the intermediaries or the large owners of parcels, while at the same time providing credit to the small farmers. And you said that the interest rate was between 9% and 10% in comparison to the loans that you could acquire through federal organizations. And after describing in chapter 3 and chapter 4 all those efforts and presenting to us a kind of vibrant civil society, then the conclusion is a kind of letdown.
It is.
The conclusion is that there is more percentage of the farmers who are taking advantage of the financing for short-term loans, and they were still at the mercy of these other non-institutional mechanisms. So that didn't square with the previous narrative that you were telling us. First, you have, in a way, a kind of consciousness about how to lobby Congress, how to get advantages. just to stay in the same system of the high credit loan offered by your neighbor, because probably you know him, the Solano in Caguas,
Sure.
whoever.
Sure.
So that was a kind of surprising conclusion for me, and I wanted to ask about why. How could
Sure.
you explain that?
Sure.
And another minor question is if you have information about the editors or the directors of the El Agricultor Puerto Rican, because it was a very important journalistic venue.
Mhm.
And you mentioned it, but there is no information about how was that particular magazine established in the first place.
So, okay, so first the cooperativas. So yes, I think you're absolutely right. I think that there is definitely an explosion of cooperative affiliation when there is the very concrete opportunity that you can now apply for a different kind of loan if you join a cooperative. And the fact that there were already ligas agrícolas made that transition into cooperatives much easier, because people who didn't necessarily know about the benefits of affiliation. Farming is a very lonely industry, right? So people were the idea or agricultural policy was from the government was, we need to talk about affiliation. And this is policy that was being talked about, these large farmers that were really well educated, right? And that were wealthy in all industries, right? Not just tobacco, but tobacco growers, sugar growers, etc. And they were all saying, this is really important, this needs to happen here. And so official agricultural policy answered that and said, yes, you're right, we need to do that. And we are going to teach people about the importance of affiliation. So that was the first piece of getting people to join ligas agrícolas, because a cooperativa is an investment, right? You buy shares into it. So that they weren't there yet, right? I mean, this other piece of let's come together and let's figure out how we can negotiate. They were doing what cooperatives do, but just in a different language, right? And you were a member of the liga, you paid a very nominal fee, but you weren't investing in shares, which is it's totally different language, right? So yes, you're absolutely right. Once there is, and after 1917, when Puerto Ricans are granted U.S. citizenship and the law is later extended in 1921, those things come together to make this huge push for affiliation, and people respond and affiliate and apply for these loans. So that's the first piece. The second piece about the loans, yeah, this was such a heartbreaking finding. Because I kept expecting to find that the financial picture had been completely changed, that people had much more access. But it wasn't enough. And the commentary throughout in the press, for example, of what is happening. So for example, when the law is extended to Puerto Rico, the Federal Banking Act, and all the other iterations of that, because there are many, because there were all these problems with the law in the US, and then when it got to Puerto Rico, then they already knew that those problems were coming, so they kept changing the law. So when the law is finally extended to Puerto Rico, people apply in really great numbers, and what is interesting is that most of the loans are going to tobacco growers, but there just are not enough loans to meet demand. And over and over and over, you see people from the Asociación, from the Cooperativa Insular de Tabacaleros, from all of these other saying, we are so glad that you gave us $50 million, but we need 150. And so there is just never enough credit. And if you can't access the credit that you need through the banks because they're done, they don't have any more loans or whatever the reason may be, then you still are going to have to grow your crop, and you will go to whichever the person next to you is. And those guys were everywhere. It didn't matter where you were. You didn't need to wait until a banking official was there. You just needed the money now. You're going to plant a cuerda. I'm going to go get money, and you would get it the next day. It was done, right? So that the ease of that, and I don't want to call it informal because it's so formal, but non-institutional, let's say, was just pervasive, and it was not going to go away. And so my question is, when this opportunity was made available, did Puerto Ricans go for it? Did they learn about it, sign up for it, take advantage of it, and they did. It just was not enough. So yeah, it's heartbreaking because they have to deal with a lot of the same. They're not able to step away completely from these intermediarios, which are.
You're mentioning only 1% of the farms on
Yeah.
a particular
Yeah.
study. Well,
But there are thousands of farms. I mean, that's thousands of farms in tobacco country.
still a very low percent.
Oh, it is. I agree. Yeah. And it's 1%, and it's like that Puerto Rico white as well. It doesn't change it, but it didn't. There have been some studies of banking in Puerto Rico, but they're institutional studies, and I thought it was an important piece of this history to tell. Do people, when there are programs, because it's one thing to fight for the extension of the law, right? So you fight for it, you lobby for it, and you win. And then do people walk the other way? And they're like, we don't care. And like you said, it's in the participation of that law that people then say, okay, we're in. We're ciudadanos, we're taking advantage of this. You know, we are going to push the limits of what it means to be, how you recognize us as citizens of your empire, of your country. So that was an important story for me. But yes, I agree with you. It is a very small percentage. And that's why I was like, I have to say that it's so little.
And could it be that because Puerto Rico was still an agricultural society in which the personal interactions
Absolutely.
were among friends or people who
Absolutely.
know one another, might be the fundamental consideration at the moment of asking for a loan. So you have your neighbor who has a lot of lands and money and available capital. Probably you prefer to go to him, even though you probably know that he's charging you 9% or 10%.
It doesn't matter. You know them, you know you can get it, you know he's going to say yes, right? Or she, if it's a woman, right? And sometimes you, it was just so readily available compared to banks. And the other thing is, you've been borrowing money for 25 years from the same person. You know, I don't know if I want to go to a bank, right? I mean, so the education had to happen there. But there was great involvement at that level, from the education of this is how it works when you apply for a loan to the actual carrying out of the application and getting the money and spending it and paying it back. And sometimes it got even more complicated, right? So you would get a loan with the bank, and then your crop was just really didn't do well, so now you're in trouble, you have to pay off your bank loan. So you go to an intermediario who's gonna give you the money anyway, because he's your neighbor and he knows you and you're not gonna run away from him, chances are, right? So then you pay your bank loan and now you're just in debt with him again, right? And some of those things could be completely out of your control, like in many agricultural commodities, right? So yeah, but excellent question, absolutely. And then, what was yours? You had another one. So a lot of the people that are writing for this are tobacco growers, actually. They do a large bulk of the writing of the articles that go in the magazine are authored by tobacco growers. Although there are other industries represented. But it's usually a member from the directiva of the asociación that takes on the editorship of that. So they're very much together. And the agricultor published every single meeting proceeding of the asociación in its entirety. Published every visit that they did on behalf of the asociación to Washington or to that's what the other thing I want to say, politics. The political parties, I'll get to that in a second. And so they were the printed voice of the asociación, for sure. That was their intention. And they would criticize the governor and the president if they had to, and call him all kinds of names. Those are the best editorials, by the way. They're phenomenal. So this is the interesting thing. So the political piece of this is fascinating because they are circumventing the ridiculously complex and corrupt, imagine that, political machine in Puerto Rico and going straight to Congress.
That's very cool.
Because they have access, right? So why do I have to deal with this guy who I don't know where the loyalty is? And there is this phenomenal cartoon, I don't have it on me or I would show it to you, where they're basically they call the Puerto Rican senators and House representatives, they call them fair weather friends. They're the first ones to say yay for the farmers and the first ones to take away money from farming, right? So they don't want to deal with them. They're disgusted by them often, and so they just get on a plane and go to Washington, or get on a boat and go to Washington before there were planes, right? Because they can meet with the president, who can send them to, or with the director of the Insular Affairs, right? As opposed to, the soplapote from the Liberal Party, who they can't stand, because in the last election, after they've all voted for him, he now is saying, I'm sorry, but the taxes are gonna have to be what the taxes are. So they're like, okay, fine. So instead of lobbying these guys to lower the tax rate, they go to Washington. So it's very interesting what happens. They don't want to deal with it. They're disgusted by it. They just have access to Washington, so they just go. You had a question, Augustine. I saw your hand.
Yeah, I mean it was more. Well, first, I really love your presentation. Great style also making your points. I was thinking. From Roberto's question and you're making clear that you cannot delete that it's a colonial context.
Mm-hmm.
That you highlight a very important set of conclusions of what motivates your work and what we can learn from it. And you said maybe it's a relational nature of imperialism and colonialism as a negotiated reality constantly and the fact that people have been fighting back. I mean, is you taking Juan Ángel Silén beyond him, no? Because he was the one who took this critique of la literatura de la docilidad.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean that's one very important thing that you learn, that we learn from your work, that you highlight that. But I think that you could highlight the other side of it, which is that this is happening within the limits of colonialism. And that's why, after all of this collective action, you can go just to one place. And I think that this is an important lesson for today. I mean, we can lobby Congress for the bankruptcy laws to be applied to Puerto Rico, but the colonial state is in bankruptcy.
No, I agree.
And the colonial state is not going to give birth to anything else. And so the limits of colonialism is the other lesson I would say that we learned from your work. Don't you think?
Well, and I think when you read the book, every other page I say within the limits of colonialism. Because it is absolutely you cannot delete it. I mean, then you're not talking history. Then you're just making it up. So I think that absolutely, but think about and this is always interesting for me. I think that I grew up there. I go 4 times a year. All of my friends are in Puerto Rico. My mother lives there. My brother. So I have a lot of daily connection to the island, and it drives me crazy that people do not realize how much they can do within the limits of the colonial empire, right? That they are using colonialism as an excuse to not do anything. And that is unacceptable, because it was unacceptable to these guys in 1899 and in 1916 and in 1929 and in 1932. It was unacceptable to think that. They weren't thinking, we are a colony and we just can't do anything, right? They were saying, no, screw you. We may be a colony, but here is what needs to happen, right? It wasn't something that got in the way of getting anything done. It was there. They accepted it, right? They're using language that is surprising. I think when you read their campaigns, we have to protect the Puerto Rican nation, and they're saying this to Congress, and Congress is saying, yeah, you're kind of right? It's beyond. We don't think that can happen, so we don't try it. We forgot that's how we got to where we are today, right? So I agree with you that ultimately the colonial question has got to be resolved, right? But that doesn't give us an excuse to sit around and say, well, we're not going to lobby for the bankruptcy laws because this is a colony, and we're just not going to do anything because it is unacceptable.
And it's a critique of what a lot of the independentista movement in Puerto Rico do, which is, until the colonial question is solved, nothing is going to happen.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then in the meantime, the question from, I think, the majority of Puerto Ricans is, okay, great, but how do I feed my family in the meantime? Right? And so there needs to be dialogue that begins from this position of there is a lot that we can do, and that does not need to be an excuse for not doing it, right? We can talk about changing the colonial structure. It has to happen. It cannot, it hasn't survived, right? It is in bankruptcy, right? I mean, it just does not work. So that has to change, right? But it can't be an excuse. That drives me crazy, right? So, and it can't be an excuse on the other side too. Yeah.
Hi. It's interesting that you point out there very quickly that your position is an unpopular one, right? Because you're stating that Puerto Ricans or tobacco workers in this industry were willing participants, that's the way you're describing them, in this U.S. colonialism imperialistic process, right? Because they were purchasing loans or getting into these cooperative relationships and so forth. My argument would be, or at least a question would be to you, then what is the alternative, right? If they needed to do this as a means of survival, what would have been the alternative? What would you have suggested that they do in the interim?
Oh, I don't. I mean, I think that you mean, what could they have done that wasn't this?
Right. Right. It almost, to me, there were no other options available. It was a means of, survival was the survival mode. It was a necessity for the people and for the country. I can't imagine what else could have been done at that time within the limits of colonialism, like you're talking about.
Sure. I mean, I think, look, what are the options here, right? I mean, the same options as always, right? Revolution.
Immolation by the nationalists.
I mean, it's an interesting, it's a really interesting question, and I am not, I am not qualified to make that kind of a what could they have done, because I suppose that you make decisions. Every time you make a decision, you use what you have in front of you to make that decision. And in their collectivity, this is what they thought was the way to safeguard what they wanted to do, which was take care of their families, right? Which was participate in an industry that was bringing in money, right? How do you participate? Why do you choose a particular career? Why do you choose, why did I leave Puerto Rico, right? Why did I stay? All of those things, all of these choices, right? You make decisions at a particular moment based on the best information that you have available.
When there's options available, but when there are no options, then sometimes you're forced to live or behave in a certain manner, because unless you create them through revolution.
Exactly. Well, or unless I think that what you are seeing in all of these cases is you are seeing people creating options, people creating opportunities for themselves, knowing that there is a market for tobacco leaf, and then figuring out what do we need to do to be competitive in that. What is my choice? I either go work. This is an agricultural society, right? In the until 1950, it's an agricultural society, right? So what are my choices? So I am an agriculturalist because that's what we're gonna do, because that's who we are, right? So what are my choices and where do I live? Do I go to a sugar region and try to get into that rat's nest because it's really complicated, right? Do I try to go to coffee country, which is also very interesting and tightly controlled? Do I go to tobacco country where maybe somebody had a farm that they're not cultivating 2 acres? Blah, 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 blah. Oh, you know what else I forgot about the loan business was that people could grow tobacco on a parcel of land that they didn't own and make money on that. And they can't get financing from banks. because they have to actually have papers that say this is my land. So I think that what you are seeing is the creation of opportunity from making sure the legislation is available, that it applies to Puerto Rican farmers, to expanding cultivation, actually growing it, not cultivating when it's not working. I mean, that No Siembra is a phenomenal study of activism and coming together. Juan Jose Valdich has a phenomenal book about the No Siembra, where a historian in Puerto Rico, sociologist actually, where he really explains what happened there. And I quoted him last night, but he talks about how this is all uncomfortable history, right? Because it means that we weren't in revolution, right? That we were participants in a colonial system that we may not have liked, but that we participated anyway. And that makes us really uncomfortable, right? We don't like that narrative, you know?
Would you say that that's the current situation right now with Puerto Rico, that we continue to be willing participants in this colonialism that exists within Puerto Rico now? Because after the agricultural period, and that was the heyday of Puerto Rico, we really haven't risen to another level with another product or another area of expertise, or you know.
But there have been pockets of greatness, right? I think that ultimately, I think that we are willing participants of a local system that is corrupt, that is partidista, right? That only cares about political favoritism, and that has very little to do with colonialism. It has to do with our own definition of what good politics looks like. So that's what I'm saying. Like, I want to call to task the people who are in local power that we elect. There's nobody forcing us to elect them, right?
Yeah. I want to say something about an important point that you mentioned. You talk at the end, the issue of victimization. For me, it was a kind of combination of factors. Last night when I was working through your chapters, and the combination of factors was in a way tragic, because I read before plunging myself into your analysis. I read the draft proposal of the Department of Natural Resources for an overdraft federal board for Puerto Rico, which is probably one of the most humiliating documents arising from the Republican Congress. And I was reading that, and then I was reading all the moments of resistance that you are identifying in those two chapters, and the contrast was deeply unsettling. I have to say that a hypothesis that I have, which is that in the 1930s, Puerto Rico, despite all the corruption out there between the Socialist Party and the Liberal Party, and the unresponsive character of the political establishment, despite all of that, you had the resistance, violent resistance, defending a kind of pure notion of the nation represented by nationalism. And then you have a vibrant civil society. You have these businesses, you have the sugarcane workers, you have people in Ponce who are not paying the private utility company, and the newspaper was saying people in Ponce are using candles in order to light up their homes, and they are willing apparently to do that. They had a strike for months because they didn't want to pay the high rates of the utility company. And something happened after the 1940s, which was the overwhelming hegemony of a new political party. That on the one hand, it was important because that party came to power with a justice. But on the other hand, that party inaugurated a profound subservience
Absolutely.
to the empire that we are at this moment harvesting, getting the consequences of Muñozismo. Even in the 1930s, Winship and other governors were having a very hard time dealing with the local legislation. The people were making fun of them. The local politicians were basically very engaging in a behavior that was intractable. They were running from governors out of town. Even Winship, I have been checking some article in the New York Times from that era. There was a moment when he came to Puerto Rico after one of his trips to Washington. The Socialist Party organized a welcoming activity. The Liberal Party organized a protest against the governor. So there was a kind of, what you mentioned here, the lack of intimidation in front of the imperial authorities. When Muñoz, that reptile nature of Muñozismo, that was a problem, because the vibrancy of civil society basically was obliterated. Another point is that at this moment colonialism was still young. Now colonialism has had other consequences in Puerto Rico. And that goes back to the issue of victimization. I think that Puerto Ricans play the role of victims, and they are engaging in what we call hysteria. They know that they are not victims. They know who they are voting for. They know the consequences of their voting. But after they vote, 1 week, 2 weeks, 2 months after the vote, they begin to complain, and they have a lloriqueo for 4 years, and then they decide to punish the winning party, and
absolutely.
they basically
And then
reproduce
we are back
the
in
cycle.
square one. Yes.
Having said that, I think that the lack of historical memory is a profound lack, wound, a bleeding wound in our national psyches. Because, for example, we don't have any collective memory of the experiences that you are presenting here. Some people died, some people emigrated, and the society, the Puerto Rican society, was unable to crystallize a collective knowledge, because it was not in the interest of the populares to defend that kind of education. So at this moment we are again facing and confronting the hard consequences. The good thing is that there are some people who are still resistant, students, people who are doing agriculture.